I want to go into what I'm really calling photographing the streets. But the truth is that this is really more than photographing the streets. We're all photographing for churches in here. Is that correct? Or schools, churches? You know, those churches, schools, you're all outreach to the community. And if you're not, then you got some challenges, I think, in front of you. So kind of what we're doing here, what I'm going to do here, is I'm going to take this from a journalistic perspective. My background's in journalism, as a photojournalist, as a director, as an editor, as an outreach to the community. And now today, I do a lot of work with the Associated Press and a lot of work with Reuters, New York Times. So I shoot quite a bit with people I don't know. You know, you have to be able to walk up to somebody that you've never met before in your life, be able to make a photograph, and then walk away. And that's kind of where I'm starting here. And if you're, probably not so much different than it is when you, as churches and schools, do outreach. So I kind of wanted to start with something here. I read this story the other day, and I don't know if you guys have ever heard of an author by the name of Annette Simmons, but she writes a lot of business communication books, and I was reading this thing, and she tells this story, and it's an amazing story. And it goes something along these lines, is that there was a guy who was an archer, and he was really good with a bow and arrow. He was great at it, actually. But he wasn't perfect. He would shoot at the target, and, he would always hit the target, sometimes around the bullseye, but always on the target. He was really good, but he wanted to be better. So what he did is he got to asking around to who the best archer was that he could follow. And he could go and learn from, maybe get somebody to be a mentor for him. So he looked and looked and looked, and he finally found somebody in another little town over that somebody said, well, there's this guy over in this other town, and every time he shoots an arrow, it's dead center bullseye every single time. Every time. So our friend, the archer, went to that village, and sure enough, as he started coming over that way, he would see targets set up, and he would see bullseye every time with the arrow. Every time. And he went on and started asking around to find who this guy was. Well, he finally found him. And he asked the guy, he said, would you be a mentor and show me how to be a better archer and how to hit the center of the target every time? And the guy says, well, maybe. So they went on with this conversation, and finally it came down to the guy said, yeah, I'll show you how it's done. It's not real hard. It's really kind of easy. So he grabs a bow and arrow, pulls the bow back, lets the arrow go, and it goes flying across, and it hits into the side of a barn, and then he runs over there with a gallon of paint and paints the bullseye around it. Now, here's the thing. We all need mentors, right? We all need the right mentors, and we all need people to help us make the right choices. And here's some of the thinking that I have. If you're struggling with your photography, find a mentor. I'll give you my contact information. You're welcome to give me a call if you want afterwards, or one of the others. But there's a lot of good mentors here. I can just tell by the questions that some of you guys just asked. About being on a cloud. You probably know a little bit about that. Somebody might ask you a question about that. Take advantage of that. It's kind of important to be able to do that. So here's the thing, guys. Buying a Nikon or a Canon doesn't make you a photographer. Not at all. Well, even a Sony. It makes you a Nikon Canon owner. There's nothing wrong with being a Nikon Canon owner, but it doesn't make you a photographer. But building relationships with subjects can. And if there's one thing that I struggle with, that we all struggle with in this business, is this. If we find the right subject, we're going to have an opportunity to make a much better photo. And there's a lot of thought that goes into that, a lot of interest. You don't just walk out on the street usually and find, the next great subject. You have to work for it. So you need to do a lot of planning. So, I don't know who wrote this, but I've often wondered about this, and my question to this is, I never really cared why the chicken crossed the road. I always wanted to know why the chicken got the road sign, which was also kind of something that was interesting to me. True story. This was a photo that I made several years back on the way to covering a plane crash, an actual plane crash. And some thinking behind it. I had a choice to make. Do I go cover the plane crash or do I stop and photograph chickens? I photographed chickens. I got in trouble over that. Here's some things. Look, here's a chicken, chickens all in that. So I say this because, it goes beyond the photograph. The questions start coming out. Is it really about the chicken? No. Somebody cared enough about their chickens to go to the county to say, I need signage to protect what's important to me, which was chickens. And of course, the cliche term and everything follows directly behind that. I say that because communications in photographs is extremely important, and it's simple. And it's this, all successful photographs do something. They never provide answers, or almost never. They almost always, make this work, they almost always ask questions. And asking the right question is really important. You have to be able, to make a photograph that makes somebody, that intrigues somebody to carry that image further, to want to know, to ask the question, why are those signs important? To ask the question of, why is this a photograph, or what is he doing, or what's going on in that picture? And you really need to think about that for a minute, because we all think of photographs as facts, or at least a lot of us do. And in some ways they are. If you photograph me getting in my Honda out in the parking lot, well, that's my Honda. It is. You're assuming that I'm getting in my Honda, I'm going to drive it. The question is, where am I going in my car? Or when am I going in my car? How fast I'm going in my car? You've got to be able to present it in a way that's kind of important. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the streets, and a little bit about language. Everybody remember doing this? And I hated this. I hated doing this. I was such a bad English student. But you diagram a sentence. You have a subject, you have a verb, and you have a direct object. And man, is that important, because theoretically you can break down, what a sentence does. This is how it applies in photograph. You have content as your subject, the action is your verb, and the background is your direct object. Now, the subject is usually fairly easy to come away with, right? Because we're there to photograph something, usually, and whatever that is usually the subject. Like if we're here to make portraits of each other today, we would know who we're going to photograph. Here's the trick. 9 out of 10 times when I have young photographers that come to me that are struggling with their pictures, I'll look at their photos and I'll ask them what the verb is in the picture. And in most cases, if they're struggling, that's what they're missing. There's the lack of action or the lack of being that's in that picture. So there's area. So when I get young photographers, this is the first thing I recommend. Photograph verbs. Go photograph some verbs. Work with verbs. The second thing, when you get to the a little further around, you start thinking about the background. And the background is your direct object. It's what affects, your subject and your verb. It's things that are there, and if you can handle the background, you can make a living at this. It is very difficult to handle the background. You frame up the photo, you look around the picture, you see what's important, you see what's not important, and you simplify. You go from an area that's really busy, or not in order or disorder, and you want to simplify it to order. So you go from disorder to order. But when I have photographers that are a little further along, this is kind of what I'm looking at. I'm looking for them to photograph modifiers. Not only can I run really fast, I want that photograph to show me why I run really fast. Am I always running downhill? Or is it the fancy shoes? Or am I being pulled in a car? But it's the modifiers you start to look at to expand the quality of your image. A little bit of philosophy there, so I kind of want you to think about that for a little bit. Well, so we're thinking about the streets, and This is the Poynter Institute, and I'm basically a photojournalist, and most street photography or outreach photography is based on photojournalism, though it doesn't have to be. And it's the craft of employing photographic storytelling to document life. And those of you that are in the ministry field, telling stories is really important to you. We can come and throw facts all day long, but facts are facts. Storytelling carries whatever you're trying to tell over an extended period of time. And I think in a lot of ways, it's the way the Bible is written the way it is, in my opinion. It's the way Jesus talked to us was through stories. It's kind of important to be able to do that. The only thing is we're doing it here with photographs. So something to think about. So what gives you the right to photograph me or anyone else? If you walk up to me on the street, legally, you have a right. But you have to get respect to be able to do that in a matter of seconds. And, basically, you have to use your body language to get respect from their body language to be able to make that photograph. If you walk up to somebody you don't know, and if you're in the ministry or in a school environment, you're doing that all the time. You might be able to walk up and talk to somebody about the weather, but to walk up to them and put a camera in front of them is a whole different kind of feel about it. You're uncomfortable, they're uncomfortable. You got to be able to put them at ease. And some things that I usually recommend. When I meet somebody, I can usually tell by their body language and their eyes within a couple of seconds on whether I can take that photo or not. And if I think I can, I approach. If I can't, I don't. And if somebody says stop photographing, I stop. Unless it's a journalistic moment and there's a criminal there, that's a little different environment. But I stop. I try to respect them. You also, the law says if you're on public property, you can make photos as long as it's with reasonable lenses. So don't go on public property with a 500 millimeter lens and photograph into somebody's property or house. Don't recommend that. But if you're on public property with a 50 millimeter lens, you can do it. So use a little bit of reasonable care when you're thinking about where and who you can photograph. Approach with respect and look for active moments versus passive moments. Photographing people who are active doing things is much more pleasing than when they're passive. Doesn't mean you can't make a great photo when people are passive. You can, but you need help. If you're photographing passive moments, you need light, or you need mood, or you need other things to influence that image to make it better. And think about the eyes, guys. It's the eyes that are usually the dead giveaway on whether you can make that picture or whether you can't. And I always think about this for a minute. And I'm often photographing people where I don't speak their language, and I'm in third world countries quite often. And when I approach these people, if I approach them with respect, which I hope I have, I can't come up and say, hey, I'm Billy Weeks and I'm here making a photograph. I have to depend on either the head nod or the eyes to let me know that it's okay. And in most cases, it is, but not in all. We all have those moments where we don't want to be photographed, so we want to kind of think about that for a little bit. So, okay. We think of photography as pictures, but they're really not. They go beyond that. It's really ideas that we're looking for. And what we're really trying to do is to bring our ideas and thoughts into photographs. And I don't mean you can't walk down the street and find something and make a good picture of it. Or if you're in a school and have a class that you want to photograph, that you can't go in and then photograph the class. What I'm really talking about is going beyond that. Getting to the point to where you're thinking about intriguing your audience rather than just making pictures or documenting. Not that documenting is not important, it is, but you want to go to where you intrigue somebody. And that means a lot of things. It means plan. the more you work at, the more you plan with your images, the more your success rate will go up. And a lot of times, that means thinking about, calling ahead, asking questions before you get there, spending time with subjects, dealing with lighting conditions, knowing what the light's like before you get there. All those things will give you opportunities to be successful. And then also, talk about an achievement plan of some sort. I have a lot of friends that use photojournals, and photojournals I think are great. Photojournals are things that do this. They'll like drive down the street and they'll see something where the light is beautiful, and they'll put their photojournal and they'll write down, 4th Avenue at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the light is beautiful, and use that so that if they want to come back by later, when something's going on in that picture, they'll have a record of it. So I think a photojournal is a great way to get you thinking about a photograph, to get you thinking about light, to get you thinking about things and places you can go to make photos. And oftentimes, especially in photography, there's a thing called the game hunter. And the game hunter goes something like this: find an area that makes a great photo and stay there and wait for something to come into that area. And I see a lot of photographers, I used to do this a lot too. I'd find an area that would be, either would have great texture to it or whatever, and I'd sit there for hours. And I would use this in news photography too. Sit there for hours until something came into my environment. The success rate is usually higher there than it is if you're just driving around or walking around looking for pictures. So use a photojournal, and a photojournal will help you. It's not just how you use your ideas, it's how you deal with them. So don't just write down that it's an opportunity to make a photograph. Write down it's an opportunity to make a photograph, but also why it's an opportunity to make a photograph. This is from a story that I did up in the Smoky Mountains about the black bear population, and we were up there working with the University of Tennessee, on which has one of the best research facilities for black bears in the country. And we were there making photos, and we were at this place that was a condominium, and the people would come out every night and watch the bears as they would come up. And I watched a grandmother pick up her grandchild and run and stick it, the granddaughter, in front of the bear and make a photo of it, and then she would walk off and step back and recompose with her camera and make a picture. And I'm thinking, are you crazy, lady? I made those photos too, but I'm not showing you those today. Here's what gets me about this. Look at this guy. He's hiding. You see the guy in the tree? Like the bear can't get in that tree. But, this is a good example of how photographs are important to us today, because we see something, we want to photograph it. I think the Time magazine, when they did their photos of the year this year, wrote that 90% of all photographs in history were made this past year. That's amazing. That's just amazing. And when you think about it, with Twitter and with all the other social media and everything that's out there, photographs have become important, and we all want to see, our grandchildren in front of bears. Why? Because it's different. So you got to think about how to shoot. When you're out in the environment, dress like the people you're going to photograph when it's appropriate. Don't be inappropriate, but be common. Don't show up in a coat and tie if you're at a baseball game to make pictures. And on the other side of that, when you go to an event that requires important dress, do it. It's important, it's respectful, and you need to be respectful. So dress common. Work in public spaces. And when I say that, photograph in parks, that's fine. Photograph with permission on private property, that's fine. Photograph in the mall, you need permission. And when I have students, I always get these wonderful photographs of people shopping in the mall. It's usually their friends, and I always say, did you get permission? Well, you can't legally do that. Are they going to throw you out? Well, probably not, but you need to think about it. And, don't necessarily look like a photographer. I'm not telling you to go in costume, but I'm telling you to go in and be yourself. And most of us aren't photographers by trade. So you want to be yourself. Set your cameras early. When I got in the car to come here today, I chose my ISO rating, and I went ahead and set my exposures to my cameras, set it in the car beside of me for what the light was on the outside. Why do I do that? Because if something happens, I can pick the camera up and shoot quickly. So when I go out to make photographs, I set the camera before I get to where I'm going to photograph. Always have it there. You never know what will happen, and you want to be able to make those photos. So do that. Understand the environment and your subject. Boy, I can't tell you how many times I've sent photographers out to make pictures and they didn't understand what they were there to make photographs of, and it's very common. Even the simplest of photos. If you're photographing a mugshot, you want to make sure the environment's correct for the background. If you're photographing in the schools, you want to make sure you've got everything in place. You need to understand who you can photograph when you get there, why you're there to make those photos, and what's important to you to tell the story. And don't be afraid to get close. I think one of the biggest failures in photography all around is people don't get close enough. They stand back. Not that giving space is always wrong, it's not. But the majority of the photos that you remember are photos where photographers have gotten close. So it's a great value. And including the environment in the picture. And by doing that, you're really working with wide angles or normal lenses, which is a 50 millimeter lens. Anything less than a 50 millimeter lens is a wide angle lens. Anything above a 50 millimeter lens technically is defined as a telephoto lens. Now, there's some 55s and 53s in there, and I consider those 50 millimeter lenses, but use a wide a lot. Approach your subject and be able to photograph the background, and be a feature hunter and be patient. Patience is tremendous in photography. Being able to see something and anticipate something that's going to happen is really important. And this is one of my favorite ones. Know the difference between looking and seeing. Looking is the big picture. If I'm sitting here and I'm looking at you guys, I see a whole lot of people sitting here in front of me. Seeing is when I go from the big picture to the small picture and simplifying the background. So be able to know the difference and to be able, to see it. It's kind of like, I don't know if any of you guys have worked with telescopes before, but when you're using a telescope and you're scanning the stars, you use a lens that's a little wider to find what you want to see, and then you come in with the bigger lens to see the details. So start wide, and then go down to a smaller version of our simplified version. And participate in the scene. Don't be afraid to walk through the scene. Don't be afraid to be a part of the scene. And don't be afraid to photograph the scene. You are there. You are a part of it. It doesn't mean you have to interrupt the scene. Don't stop somebody from doing what they're doing, but participate in it. Go into it. And here's maybe the most important one of all. If you don't smile a lot, if you come in where your body language is angry, you're going to get angry photos. So don't be afraid to be yourself and smile. Don't be afraid to do that. It'll make a huge difference in the way your images look. Okay. The important parts. This is up at the Ocoee River. That guy didn't make it back in the boat. He didn't make it. Don't scare your subjects. I got to tell you, I've seen photographers that scared me, and you got to you got to understand, you're approaching somebody, sometimes you may not know them. It's easy to take that camera and put some negative emotions into people, so don't scare them. Don't steal a picture. If somebody tells you no, back away. It's just that simple. There's no need to steal it. Also, some things that are connected with stealing. Somebody objects, don't take it. And if somebody turns away, respect them and refrain from shooting. You do not have a right to own their image unless they give you that right. You really, I can't tell you how much, and I've said respect probably 15, 20 times up here already, maybe more than that. But the real trick to being successful at this, and I don't care what kind of photographs you're making, whether it's news pictures, whether it's wedding photos, whether it's photographs on the street, it's all about respect. And it's so important to be able to do that. The other thing is, if you're walking through an environment, don't hide your cameras. I used to have a photographer that worked for me that used to come in and say he'd like to photograph from the hip, and he would carry his camera down here, and he'd walk through an area, and he'd shoot a bunch of pictures as he's walking through. And sure, the pictures, some of them were interesting, but they weren't fair. I'm not interested in photographs where the cameras are hidden or secret cameras. I'm just not interested in that. I don't think that's fair. So I recommend not doing that. Don't hide with long lenses and telephoto lenses and photograph that way either. Be out in the open. And I always recommend approaching the subjects. If you're photographing with long lenses and there's a subject in it, I always try to approach them, and just to be fair about it. I think it's kind of important to do that. All right. Any questions about that? That was a lot of boring stuff. Yes.
Do you always carry release forms with you? Or what do you do when in the situations where you're just describing? Maybe you're out in the field such as this. I mean, of course, that's a group shot, but let's just say that you have one person predominant in there. Do you have a release form that you walk up to them and talk?
I do have release forms. I rarely use them because most of what I do is documentary work, and in journalism, I have a right to photograph. I do always try to approach them, though, and talk to them. If I think the picture has got a use beyond journalism, I have them sign a release, or at least ask, and it's, of course, at that point, it's up to them. It's a good idea if you're photographing on your own, running a studio, so forth and so on, to have release forms. That's a really good idea. So it's an interesting thing because churches aren't covered under journalism. It's two different things. And I've been in the mission field before and made photographs away from the mission groups, and those photos have been published. And you have to really think about that. Is that fair? And you have to think about it. Yes, you can put a release in front of them. Most people don't understand what that release really means. And so I think you did the right thing by trying to explain it to them. Take the time to answer their questions. They have a total right to say, I don't want my picture on the internet, but you can use it for publication. Or to say, I don't want you to use it at all. They have a total right to say that, and respect that. Yes, sir.
My question would be related to technique and the picture that you just took down. It's an action picture, and you're shooting manual. How do you set it so you can get what you want manually, because it's changing so quickly?
Well, depends on the first thing is to choose the correct ISO, choose the correct sensitivity to the chip. And then you go through a series of things, which we'll get to in just a second, but we'll go through a series of things of deciding whether we need a higher shutter speed or whether we need more depth, as with the depth of field. So I didn't really answer your question. So it's really depending on the environment that you're standing in.
And I'm such an amateur, I'm not sure I understand. I do understand ISO, but depth of field and some of these are pretty big.
Yeah. Depth of field is the aperture on the camera. The higher the number of the aperture, the more that's in focus in the picture. Say I was photographing my glasses here from over there with a high depth of field, this would be in focus, and so would my hand. Both of them would be in focus. With a very shallow depth of field, just the glasses would be in focus, and this would be out of focus. The other hand would. That's kind of, and there's different levels of that depending on which aperture you choose. Let's just start with some of this, just to get down to some basics here. The number one thing in photography is to be simple. Just keep it as simple as you can keep it, and if you can do that, it'll be a big help. Look for line inside your photos, and I'm talking composition here. Notice how the line comes from here up. You want to be able to move somebody's eye across the plane. And even if you're shooting with your point-and-shoot cameras, these are kind of some things you want to be thinking about as far as simplifying what you have there. So you want to simplify the frame as much as you can, and you want to have movement, and line is the way to do that. Secondary elements in your pictures. When you're framing up a photograph, you want to look for a simplifying moment. So you've got an element here. You want the second element to be half that size. The reason I say that is that what this is really telling me is this is most important, and oh, by the way, this is important too, but it's not as important. So you look for simplifying that second element. Light, don't fight the light. Sometimes, if you're using your point-and-shoot camera and you're looking at this, it's probably going to make where you can see this and not see that. This is going to go white. So you want to be able to see the light and make adjustments between the foreground and the background. So look for light, don't fight it, choose the best direction. And when you're talking about light, this is a portrait that was made from light coming from a door, just with a door open, and that's what this is. It's reflective light. If you're photographing this kind of a photograph, a couple of things to think about. The exposure is not here. It's not. You have to actually put your exposure on this little bit of rim light that comes around the corner here, and your camera meter is going to tell you wrong on this kind of a photo. So whatever the camera meter says, then you're going to have to readjust it and take your best guess at the light here. Look for action, always action. And also find a point of interest. And we were talking a few seconds ago about depth of field. And this picture is a good example of that. See, it's sharp here. This is the depth of field. It's a very low aperture reading, and it's sharp here. And then it's out of focus here in the foreground and here in the background. This is a good example of how an aperture actually plays an important role in storytelling, simplifying the image as much as possible. Details. There are three things that when photographers go out to shoot that I talk to them about. One of them is shooting an overall shot that sets the scene. The second one is a medium shot, and a medium shot is usually where the action is. And then the third is detail shots. Detail shots are things that other people generally don't see. So you want to be thinking about this a lot. This is a tremendous storytelling element. All right, exposure. Exposure equals time over intensity. What that really means is exposure equals shutter speed over aperture. And with the shutter speed, you're making a decision, as we talked about earlier, you're making a decision on movement that comes across your frame. And with the intensity or the aperture, you're making a decision on the depth that's actually sharp in the picture. This exposure, the formula for exposure, actually will allow you to photograph just about anything, whether it's in total darkness or not. You might just have to use a tripod to do it. Often we talk about color, and this actually doesn't look right up here with the projector, but successful color photos to me are the absence or the lack of color, and not the abundance of it. If you get a lot of color up there, you get a lot of competition for your content. So something to kind of think about. Look for patterns, and then look for objects that break those patterns. Lots of trees in a row, lots of buildings in a row, and then look for things that break that pattern. And it's a great composition tool to use, and I think it will help with your photos. And perhaps if I could tell you one thing about photography, before you go out on any assignment, is to completely fill up your frame. And I think it's one of the biggest failures of young photographers or inexperienced photographers that there is, that they see something, they take a picture, but they take it from a distance that's too far away. So don't hesitate, to charge up there and fill up the frame. Look for texture. Notice the way the background here is broken up. Texture is tremendous for handling the background or the direct object of your photograph. So look for texture. Look for opportunities that that add to the photo. And what texture actually does is that it makes the background all work as one. It takes whatever's going on in the background, and when you look at it with your eye, you see it all together. And look for humor. Look for things that are just out of line. I love all these guys with their cell phones taking a picture of that fish. It's just one of those moments that you just don't think about. But if you go to the Atlanta, Aquarium, you'll see this. It's not uncommon. It happens all the time, every day there. And then they've also got a sign up that says you can't take these photos there too. Or you can't publish them. They don't say you can't take them. They say you can't publish them, which this hasn't been published. Yes, sir.
Going back to that last photograph you had there with the textures.
Yes.
With the lady. That looks to me like probably a third world country or something.
It's the Honduras.
Yeah. So in that case, you probably didn't speak the language there.
I work with an interpreter.
Okay. So did you approach that lady, and did she pose there, or you just?
She did not pose there. She was working out here in the front, and we approached her, told her what we were doing, and she was just talking to us. I rarely pose photographs unless it's corporate kind of advertising work, but most of everything I do is just the way I see it. Most of it. Now, one of the things that I would recommend, though, is something called the saturation method when it comes to photographing. And here's kind of the way it works: is that I'll start shooting, and I'll shoot 6 frames, trying to improve on each of those frames, and then I will move over here, and then I will shoot 6 more, trying to improve on that, and then move back over here and shoot another burst of 6 or 7 images to try to make it better. At some point, especially when you're photographing somebody like this, they become, they know what you're doing, but they don't pay as much attention to you at that point, and it becomes more of a candid moment.
Do you manipulate your images after you, like this? This is just the way you shot it.
Well, manipulation is a tough word. Do I change the content? Absolutely not. Do I tone it slightly? I do slight toning and burning, and you probably picked up on I do convert a lot of it to black and white. If that's manipulating, then I convert them to black and white, but I wouldn't call that manipulating.
Well, I meant that, but also changing the composition. For instance, in this particular picture, maybe you took a wider picture of the horse, but it looks better if it's cut off a little bit.
No, I don't. I try my best to crop in camera when I can. Not everything is cropped in camera, but I try to. And I would not electronically manipulate anything. And here's a couple things you ought to remember: is that your integrity is only as good as your last photo. And if anybody questions that photo, they question everything that you present to them. And if you're dealing with church material, and you've got a photo that's been manipulated to the point that the content is different, you got a problem, because I'm not going to believe it when you send it to me or when I read it. I'm just not going to believe it. And so I really recommend that you stay as true to that image as you possibly can, as you would in your writing. When you write about that moment, you would want to be true to that moment also. So I mean, that would be my recommendation. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I guess my question has to do with the timing of asking permission. There's lots of times that the opportunity comes that you've got to shoot instantly. Do you go and ask permission afterwards?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I make it a point to have some sort of personal communications with that person. And I think that's so important to be able to do that for a lot of reasons. Number one, you just met somebody that you didn't know, and if you're in the mission field, that's an opportunity to be, to exercise your missionary skills at that moment. That's an opportunity. Another opportunity is that, you want them to know what you're doing, what you're doing with it, kind of why you shot it. That moment, that conversation may lead to other photographic moments, and they may say, well, we're on our way out to the fields to work in the fields, and you might get to go and make those photos, and that might be even better. So yeah, have that conversation. It's important. Yes, sir.
I shoot in church a lot. Sometimes I'm asked to, and sometimes I'm not. I just do it because that's what I do. But we often have groups. I'm in Knoxville First, and we have Advent House, which is our young people's group there. And so oftentimes I will put composite videos and things together with various groups that are singing. Do we need individual permission from those, since it's in a church setting and they are doing it's the praise time, that kind of?
Yeah, the question would be, what are you going to use it for? If you're, my guess is all of them would say, sure, go ahead and use it. It would be fine. Legally, I think you got to ask the question. You got to ask permission legally. So I would recommend that, but you're not going to have anybody question that. No. Yeah. Legally, you need to just tie up the loose ends. So was there another hand that was up? Yes, sir.
I hear you presenting, crafting a statement, okay? So, you have your subject, verb, etc. And in the context of being here personally, I'm looking at presenting the gospel through this methodology. And so you've got two things that we're talking about. Right now we're talking about the imagery part of it, but you're a photojournalist, so you're also going to talk about the dialogue that goes on with this image. I'm very interested in that, and especially in the implication of, I'm just taking some pictures. No, I'm not just taking some pictures. As you said before, there's got to be a reason for them. Does every picture have to have a gospel reason for it? That's a great question. I mean, you're taking pictures of children in school. It has an offset of they're getting Christian education, I understand. But somehow you're going to make a decision what that sentence, what that statement is going to be that you're trying to capture. And I'm sort of looking for ideas for that.
Well, am I working here? I'm sorry, I dropped this off. Yeah, well, you've got to, in some ways, you've got to be a journalist. I mean, you've got to know what the story is there, and if there's a big failure in communicating religious material, or it's that it doesn't have a story with it. 99% of the material that I get about missionaries is a picture of the two missionaries standing in front of their home or wherever they're living, and then they say all about, they're from Tulsa, Oklahoma, and they're there to do whatever they're there to do, but they never show, or to be reasonable and fair about what's actually going on there. So my recommendation is I would do away with those pictures that show the missionaries standing there, and I would definitely go to why they're there. They're there to spread the gospel, but here's the way they are doing it, and I would highly recommend that story be based off what they are doing and why they're doing it, because that's what interests me. That's what people are going to look at and want to know a little bit about what's going on. They can still, put a little mugshot of themselves at the very beginning of it, or the end of it, if they wanted to. But and then, you have to craft that story. And when I say craft, I mean it takes time. You know, you don't just drive out in a car one day and make a picture of people drilling a water well and come back and say, well, here's our water well, and here's our guys from Oklahoma standing in front of our water well. You don't do that. That doesn't tell me anything other than they've had enough money to buy a plane ticket. So you want to dig deeper into that. Now,
So it should tell a story.
you should tell it, absolutely. It's storytelling. Photographs are storytelling. Successful photographs are storytelling. They are not pictures, or shouldn't be. And that's a really hard thing to do. And in storytelling, you know, you've got to find a moment to get into the story. You've got to find the middle of the story, which is what's actually going on. And then you have to find a time to get out of that story. And, you know, and getting out of that story is the hardest part. Because as soon as you leave, something else happens there that you've missed. So you have to figure out, you know, how to tell that story with the photos. Did that help any? Yeah, good. The checklist. And this is really a little bit about editing. And when you get back and you see all your photos, some of the things I want you to think about when you're looking through your photos and you're getting ready to address what you've done. I want to know if the images are sharp. If they're not sharp or in focus, it's probably not something you want to publish. Is the exposure right? Meaning you have correctly chosen the right exposure for the photo. Do you have a clear subject? Man, I don't know how many pictures I see that the subject's not clear. Have I simplified my background? Making sure that the background is nice and simple. Making sure that there's not trees coming out of the backs of the heads. Making sure there's not a clock back there that's in the back of the head. Oh, here's a big one. Make sure that you have shot both horizontal and vertical photos, because if you've got a publication you're working on, sometimes design needs to see a different shape of photo. So I want you to think about that while you're out there. You know, make sure you turn the camera both horizontal and vertical, and make sure that the color is right. You can correct some color in post-production work in Photoshop, but if it's right in camera, it certainly makes it a lot easier to when you get to that point. Yes, ma'am.
You know, there's some photographers that take a lot of those angled, skewed ones.
Yeah.
Is there a percentage of how many skewed ones you should have on a publication or?
Yeah, 0.
I don't like them, but often I see them, and some people just love them, and especially like if you see wedding pictures, there's some photographers who take every picture like that.
Yeah. Here's my thinking behind. Here's my thinking behind it. If people are looking at your photographs because you've tilted the horizon, then you've missed the content. I want people to look at my photos because of the content. And if I'm photographing a bride and groom, I want people to be interested in the bride and groom, not the fact that the photographer had one leg shorter than the other one. So that's kind of my thinking behind it. Yes, ma'am.
I photographed for an elementary school, and we have the traditional, you know, big programs where all the kids are up on the platform, or you've got all of first grade or all of second grade. Do you have a suggestion? Because I never know, do I try to get the whole group in? Do I try to zero in on just a couple of the kids and then have multiple pictures? Because every parent wants their child on the website. Do you have any guidelines or suggestions?
Yeah, here's my recommendation. Start wide and photograph the whole group wide. Leave enough depth in there, if you can, so that they're all in focus. But start with the wide photo. Come down to the medium picture, which is the picture of a couple of them singing, you know, 2 or 3 together, 4 or 5 together, whatever they're doing. And then go to the tight photos. So you're thinking in 3 different levels as you go through that.